can I just say a few words of welcome to you, Michèle, and please introduce you. As you all know, Michèle Lamont is one of the most distinguished voices in current cultural and comparative sociology. He is the Robert Goldman Professor of European Studies at Harvard, and also Professor of Sociology and of African and African American Studies at Harvard, where she also directs the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs. I won't go through the many awards and distinctions she has received for her work, which focuses on inequality, racism, stigma, and most importantly, from a Frankfurt perspective on the dynamics of recognition in current societies. Won't mention her many and great books. I just mentioned that she has a new title for her presentation today, Gaining the Future, Producing Hope and Recognition for the New Gilded Age. Great to have you here. The digital floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So I'm trying to share my slide. Do you see it?
Yes, it works. Thank you so much.
Okay, so you see what I see. Okay, so thank you very, very much for this invitation. It's a real pleasure to be with you. I'm going to talk to you about a book in progress, which is also embedded in several papers that I'm developing with graduate students. And it's a book about this crisis that American society is facing in a context of growing inequality, where fewer people are believing in the American dream. So I'm interested in the production of new narratives of hope. Where do they come from? Who produces them? But also, how do they resonate and are appropriated by Gen Zs? A generation made up, normally described as including the 18 to 23-year-old who have been leading social change in social movements this summer and who are, of course, experiencing enormous insecurity at the time due to COVID, but also the growing inequality and the movement for racial justice this summer. So this is a research team that has been working with me, very central to the project. So the book is concerned with recognition. And these two T-shirts here tell you a little bit about what this is about. It's a project about social inclusion. It's a project about social cohesion and the destigmatization of stigmatized group. And these are values that are really central to this Gen Z group, where they want to embrace a greater inclusion, sustainability, authenticity as the key values. So the T-shirt that says, I see you, this person, it's a they, and Joey Soloway, and she is at the center of television shows that have been extremely popular in diffusing or popularizing what is the life of queer people like. So the central concept I borrow from Axel Honneth, the concept of recognition, the social act by which the positive social worth of an individual or group is affirmed or acknowledged by others. And it's the opposite of stigmatization, the process that consists in qualifying negatively identities and differences. I approach these as cultural processes, that is action performed by people unfolding through everyday interaction as they live their life. And it involves transforming intersubjective definition of reality. This is from a paper that is cited down there that anchors this book, which is written for a wide audience, which means that a lot of these theoretical discussions are not in the book. And the first part of the book offers a diagnosis, which has to do first with the hegemony of neoliberal scripts of self, which has gained so much, has become omnipresent in American society, with its focus on defining human worth in terms of money, competition, self-reliance. And it has come hand in hand with the cultural hegemony of the American upper middle class. And it has meant a loss of recognition and dignity for those who are not college-educated professionals and managers. So it has had many negative consequences, gigantic mental health crisis for the upper middle class itself, with a lot of young people rebelling against what their parents want them to do, which is to stand in line and engage in this crazy competition, But for the working class and the poor, of course, huge opioid crisis. So not doing too well. And under Trump, we've seen also a rigidification of group boundaries toward ethno-racial minorities, LGBTQ racial. Yeah. So, and all this has been worsening by the climate of uncertainty and growing inequality that has come with COVID and the movement for racial justice. So we know that neoliberalism has become even more omnipresent than it was in the 80s when it emerged with the influence of Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. Here you have the number of references to it in newspapers based on a LexisNexis database. And you can see that it's as salient in the US as it is in Europe. So I could spend a while giving you evidence of this crisis in mental health that I've mentioned, but among American undergrads, there's been a huge increase in number of people who are not doing well in terms of mental health. So this is one table among many that will illustrate this. And all universities are now overwhelmed with demands for support from our students when it comes to mental health. So part 2 of the book is really about the solutions. And this is where I preach the religion of sociology by saying, you know, the solution is not in individual resilience, but in understanding what are the cultural narratives that are serving as sources of hope for the population. So as a cultural sociologist, I say it's a story of cultural production and diffusion. Who produces the new narratives? Where do we find them? What kind of messages are they giving us about recognition? And indirectly, given your focus on social cohesion, the weakening of group boundaries. Are they promoting more pluralistic criteria for it? Are they generating new forms of everyday cosmopolitanism, which have to do with the fact that we're all equal as human beings, as children of God? There's many forms that it takes, but these are all rhetorics that have to do with downplaying the social hierarchies. And how do groups become destigmatized? So the book itself will not engage with the literature, but these are various papers that I've written over the last 6 years or so that are all feeding the theoretical agenda behind the book. And I'm just mentioning them here in case you, social scientists, are interested in pursuing them. Probably the most important of these papers in terms of defining the agenda of the book is From Having to Being, which is the 2019 British Journal of Sociology annual lecture. So the model of, in terms of destigmatization, is to look at social actors, for instance, Gen Zs or the agents of change, who I will describe in a second, as people who are drawing on ideologies, on cultural repertoires that are surrounding us. For instance, repertoires having to do with the therapeutic self or neoliberalism, American dream, others, to develop scripts of self and to also redefine various groups that are destigmatized, stigmatized, to reframe them differently. So this is a model of destigmatization that we develop in the paper mentioned here, where we look at the case of people with HIV/AIDS, the obese, and African Americans as 3 groups that have destigmatized at very different rates in American society. The book is essentially about the US, but there's also a lot of references to other countries and to changes in Canada and Europe. So it's a story of social processes and the role of culture role played by culture in those social transformation of basically growing social cohesion, weakening group hierarchies, promoting recognition for the largest number. So the data I have conducted, or I have done most of these interviews, but some of my students have helped as well, 150 interviews with agents of change. So those are people who are diffusing these narratives that redefine, reframe stigmatized groups and try to transform society in various ways. So it ranges from climate change to lots of people in the entertainment industry, stand-up comics, and the inclusive people who are engaged in inclusive capitalism, impact investment, for instance, who are some of them funding Black Lives Matter, and are enabling a lot of the social change that is central to American society now. We've also re-interviewed 15 people that had been African Americans that had been interviewed in 2008 for the book Getting Respect that I've co-authored with colleagues in Israel and Brazil, to try to understand how they are understanding the American dream differently now as compared to 2008, after this period of growing inequality. And finally, we have 80 interviews with Gen Zs from the East Coast and the West Coast. And the interviews were conducted last fall before COVID. And there was a second wave this summer to try to capture how their perceptions of the future is shaped by this amazingly high level of uncertainty that they're now experiencing, both as students and as young people who cannot make many decisions about where they are heading. A lot of the book is focused on this literature on how people are constructing the future in a period of uncertainty. So also central to this book is the concept of the public sphere and how it is changing empirically from Habermas's original contribution to what we have now. And this analysis draws on the two papers that are cited here, that are two wonderful papers that are providing a very useful update on what this public sphere looks like empirically at the current time. How does it focus very differently than what Habermas had described? So the model looks a little bit like this, various professional groups, various organizations and social movements contributing to produce cultural repertoires that are novel in many ways. And a lot of what the book will do is document how are they novel. So I'm going to describe to you some of these 150 respondents. So you have, for instance, actors from the show Queer Eye, which has been enormously successful, or the producers of The Handmaid's Tale. And this is a quite unique sample. No one has a sample like this one, where we look at the showrunners, the people who are producing these shows, like Jill Soloway, who is behind Transparent, which is one of the first shows that, where you see a middle-aged man with his 3 kids who decides to become a woman in the middle of his life. And then the depiction is really about helping the audience understand the lived reality of this person and to connect with him as a human being. So these shows have had an enormous impact in terms of humanizing groups that had been deeply stigmatized. And, so this has been a huge transformation with the Netflix we've interviewed Channing Donghae, who has empowered Shonda Rhimes and Ava DuVernay, the leading African-American woman producers who are truly transforming what mainstream entertainment looks like in the US. And then we've interviewed the philanthropist, and a lot of the work of the philanthropy now has focused on the transformation of narratives. So while you have some philanthropy that are mostly interested in influencing the distribution of resources, for instance, Gates, that has embraced a lot of experiments. The Ford Foundation has dedicated an enormous amount of resource to the transformation of narratives. So that is very important in terms of understanding how social cohesion is produced, because they are systematically thinking about how can we produce messages and diffuse messages that are celebrating we-ness in various forms. And the first person that is listed there under philanthropy, Leah Hunt Hendricks, is part of the Hunt family, Texas multimillionaires. And she's among the young philanthropists, mid-40s, who has been funding Me Too and Black Lives Matter. So there's been a huge amount of those people who are also producing social change at the ground level. And then you have the cultural producers themselves, stand-up comics, Camo Bell, for instance, the African-American man who tries to show to the middle America, what a middle class Black man married with a white woman looks like when it's not Bill Crosby, but someone who can also demonstrate what really racism on a daily basis is about. So all these questions have become really front and center in what people can see on a daily basis as they are watching Netflix, which we've all been spending enormous amount of time doing. And what I want to talk to you about is one specific segment of the study, which is about photographers, Black photographers and queer photographers who have been working very hard at trying to transform how Americans perceive African Americans. So those are the people I've interviewed who are part of this sector of cultural activity. And what do they do? As I interview them, they talk about trying to provide more three-dimensional depictions of a stigmatized group, to humanize and dignify them, represent them, make them visible, and describe them the way they would like to be described. So some of them is Catherine Opie, a queer photographer who has done exactly what I just described. This is one of her pieces, which is, kite, rainbow kite. So she's part of the letter community in LA. And she, at the beginning of her career, she did a series on this community. And she says, normally we're thought of as child molesters. We have a bad rap. That's probably the biggest reason why I did this portrait. I wanted to represent them, to do a body of work that was about being really out about my sexuality and being into the S&M and letter stuff. But instead of just showing the tattoos and the piercing, I wanted to do a series of portraits of this community that were incredibly noble. And there's a lot of emotion and love in the way that she describes them, to really get the audience to enter into their world and understand what they get emotionally from being part of this leather community, which most people just don't understand. And Hanks Willis Thomas has done a huge series called Question Bridge, where he interviewed men across the US, Black men, asking them the question, what does it mean to you to be a Black man? And he found that there's a huge diversity in how they represent themselves. And in the interview, he said, I wanted to deconstruct this notion of Black man identity because it's a figment of European imagination. And he said they have nothing in common but the fact that they are facing the same prejudgment that people place upon us. But what's also really important here is that this project was supported by a very important foundation and that it was circulated massively in schools and museums. And there was a lot of community engagement and conversation around it to really try to transform at the societal level, how people understand who the Black man is, which is really a scary figure in American society, as you probably all know. So, and to humanize them. So those are examples, and their work is empowered by foundation. And Catherine Opie, I should say, is on the Andy Warhol Foundation. She's also a major gatekeeper. So these are extremely, extremely prominent artists. So this, in case you feel like Googling it, you just Google Question Bridge and you will be able to listen to all these extremely diverse Black men talking about their life experience and what it means for them. It's a very amazing experience to watch it. So where does the money come from? Well, one of the sources is this guy, Sean Dove, who was at first supported by the Open Society Foundation and was then able to create a separate philanthropy, the campaign for Black male achievement. And his goal is very much to transform language and narratives in storytelling. He says to provide a platform for leaders to tell their stories and to really build this brand of Black male achievement. But more broadly, how come this is not moving forward? I'm stuck. Okay, here you go. It says we are creating a framework of respect. We were talking about Black men and boys to not identify people first by their problem and what's wrong with them, with Black people being about poverty in the face of crime, but by defining them by aspiration. So a very clear desire to reframe what they are about. So as I continue to write the book, it will really be describing how this massive enterprise of re-engineering the description and the representation of stigmatized groups in American society is taking place. And, we're all aware of artists to do these things, but I think there hasn't been a systematic attempt. And this is now extremely salient in American society after the summer of fight against racial, violence against racial police violence. So I think the timing for this is amazingly important. Now, turning in the last 10 minutes to the part of the project that is more concerned with the Gen Zs, here we are interested in what kind of society they want to live in, what are the values that are most important to them. And I'm co-authoring papers with two graduate students, Shira Zilberstein and Mary Sanchez, who also conducted the interviews. That was partly important that they be interviewed by people who are close to them in age, because talking with someone like me would be like talking with their parents. It would not be particularly fruitful, I think. So the first paper is really about the braiding of repertoires, the ways in which they are drawing on a range of cultural repertoires to make sense of their life and to describe where they want to go and what kind of what is their representation of the future, what are their hope, and who gives them hope. And the other paper is about social resilience and how the promotion of diversity and recognition figures in how they think about the conditions that make them and make the society more socially resilient, which is not the same as individual resilience. So why focus on Gen Zs? Here again, you have a LexisNexis graph that shows how frequently these two groups have been mentioned in the media, especially look at the salience of Gen Zs over the last 2 years, extremely high. So those representations of Gen Zs are important. We don't necessarily believe, Gen Zs is like a demographic group, but also there's such a strong cohort narrative about the group. We're not pretending that the group is unified culturally. Of course, there's an enormous amount of difference, but the fact that the group is so much discussed in the media also makes it much more salient as an intersubjective reality for the public at large, but also for them. And they have been depicted as the leaders of a lot of the social change that is happening now, especially since they define themselves against boomers, my generation, and view us as lazy people who got everything and did nothing with it. So the way in which they are thinking about, social mobilization, not only against people, behind people like Sanders, but at a much broader level is extremely salient in the American context. So what narratives are they looking at? So they are facing this amazing period of crisis and uncertainty. So it's a particularly important time where we can end the mental health problems that I mentioned earlier, and the growing inequality means that it's much harder for them to think that they will live the American dream. So what are their alternatives? So we look at the braided repertoires. We have identified inductively through in-depth analysis using Ed Vivo of all the interview that we've conducted, that they are drawing on 4 different kinds of narratives. The American dream and neoliberalism is still present, but it is also combined with the therapeutic ethos, which is about self-care, living in the present, and being in harmony with one's emotion, which is very much in tension with the American dream, which was all about competing no matter what. And the attention to mental health is crucial here. Ordinary cosmopolitanism is about a desire to live in a society that are more inclusive, where people are more oriented toward community. And the cohort narrative is about how they distinguish themselves from boomers and their progressivism, et cetera. I know that we have most of our sample, which is from the Midwest and the East Coast, are middle-class people, but we do have working class people. There's not many differences between the groups, but the working class people are more focused on materialism than the other groups. So you cannot really read this very well given the time that we have at our disposal, but this gives you a little bit of an idea of which are the elements of these 4 cultural repertoires that they are drawing on, which one they are criticizing, and how they are combining various elements in their braided repertoire. So you can see here that recognition of the plurality of life path is very central to them. There's an acceptance, like the T-shirt we saw at the beginning, I see you, which is, do you, be you, and that's fine. You don't have to do what I do. And the notion of moral character and communal participation. So if, in relation to your conference, if we want to understand the transformation of group boundaries and how social coherence or social cohesion is produced, we can look very closely at groups such as the Gen Zs to understand what is the rhetoric that they're drawing on for themselves to how do they themselves understand what may produce a more inclusive society. And they're working very hard against various kinds of boundaries, such as racial boundaries and sexual boundaries. Now, of course, there's a lot of, here we're focusing on the more progressive, liberal segments of the population. I'm not looking at the supporters of Trump. That would require another study altogether. But we know that this is a group that is overall very progressive. So, for instance, in our paper, we cite the Pew Foundation is one of the foundations that write papers about what the Gen Zs look like. And they find that something like 62% of them are in favor of adding other categories of self-identification between men and women on forms. So that's an indication, that's a national survey of how progressive this group is. So I don't have much time left, so I think I will skip the quotes, but I'll just mention one. So the whole point of America is to have different diverse background, different religion, different freedoms. So there's no reason to abandon your culture to go play golf on Sunday or to go to a Christian church. So a lot of what they're saying is about authenticity, be passionate, dedicate yourself to something that's meaningful to you, be you. I mean, the whole section could be called Just Be You. And that's also a celebration of a plurality of life path. And a lot of this is tied to moral character, just be a good person, be nice. Like one of the T-shirts, be a kind human. So the notion of just be a kind human is extremely central, like kindness. It's not viewed as a tacky reference, but as something very meaningful since we have to live together in society. And communal participation, being involved in transforming our society, is absolutely central to them. And again, in contradistinction to the boomers. So there are group boundaries that are being reconfigured, and some of this is implicit exclusion toward the working class. I'm sure that along the lines of Arlie Hochschild's argument that you're going to hear about this afternoon, probably. And finally, we study social resilience, which is the capacity of groups to sustain their well-being in the face of challenges. But we're saying social resilience because this is based on social resources, institutions, and cultural repertoires. So we look at the model that the theoretical model we operate with focuses on the cultural resources that are diffused by institutions, networks, and other media, and that are feeding various scripts of self, both autonomous and collective selves. I don't have time to discuss this, but then this is creating various mechanisms that are feeding into social resilience. And one of these mechanisms has to do specifically with promoting destigmatization and inclusion and connection. So that's the one that I was going to talk about today, but I don't have much time. Basically just think about the fact that them promoting greater interconnectedness makes them believe that this is really where social resilience comes from. We don't think of social resilience as something that you have or you don't have, but rather as a collective social process that results from various kinds of connections that people are building that can serve as resource. And it is tied to destigmatizing. So here again, you have the same themes: be kind, respectful, loving. I do my best to treat everyone with respect. I think it's so important to lead a good life. Being your best self includes loving others and being kind and respectful. It might seem like, Christian narratives, but these are things that are very salient throughout the interviews. So in conclusion, this is the concluding slide. that for them, realizing a more inclusive vision of a more inclusive future involves orienting their personal projects toward collective well-being, developing a sense of obligation to do my part. They are very dedicated to bottom-up activism, especially at the very local level, and they perceive themselves as an activist generation, which informs their personal pathways to change. So in terms of your conference, the big takeaway is if one wants to understand social cohesion and what feeds it, one can look at the worldviews and the action of specific groups such as the Gen Zs, but also focusing specifically on the producers of new cultural repertoire and the relationship between their work and what are the repertoire that Gen Zs are embracing and who they are citing as sources of inspiration is a way to, I think, move forward the agenda through really empirically grounded research that helps us understand what are the cultural processes at work. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm sorry that I had to rush through so much information, but here we are, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you so much for all this. Floor is open. Yeah, Olaf.
Yeah, thank you so much, Michèle. I find that really highly interesting. And my question is a rather simple one. I really would like to ask you, to what extent do you believe that class matters for these kind of narrative of hope? And you already mentioned, I mean that in two respects. So one respect is in terms of the actors of these movements, and you already mentioned that you mostly interviewed middle class people, but also some of the Afro-American people. And you didn't find large differences. Still, the question is, to what extent do these movements cover also all different kinds of classes? And then, on the other hand, in terms of the idea of inclusivity, it's much geared towards diversity, towards different sexual orientations, towards something like life balance and maybe ecological questions, but to what extent is there really a vision of an inclusive society in terms of class and inequality, or to what extent are the cultural practices and ideas also still means for some symbolic distinction against against other classes? I think that would be really that's a question that really interests me.
Yeah. I think it's a great question. And this is actually something we were emailing about yesterday with Shira and Marie. We know that a lot of the values that the Gen Zs are embracing are about sustainability, inclusion, authenticity, and they are rejecting people who don't have these values. And often in the background, these people may be working class people, although we don't have quotes where they say this, but we believe that given how highly segregated American society is, the number of them who have regular contacts with people who would be explicitly homophobic, Islamophobic, is basically null. I mean, they don't have these experiences, therefore these people are not salient. And, you know, as you would imagine in the context of the election, everyone looks with horror at the people that we've interviewed, the kind of people we've interviewed are not identified as Trumpians. The East Coast sample is largely upper middle class and middle class. The Midwest sample has more working class people. And we have coded the data, and we know that the only really noticeable difference between the working class and the middle class people in the Midwest sample is that the working class people are more focused on pursuing material, they need to support their family, and but they embrace a lot of the values of the others. But it's possible that this is simply an effect of, being college students. We recruited our respondent through colleges. So it means, and that's 50% of the cohort. So there's a 50% of Gen Zs that are simply not part of the study. And that would have to be another project altogether. And I don't know if anyone who studied the non-college educated Gen Zs at this point. I think it would be extremely important to understand, for instance, the support for Trump and many other things. And of course, the rise of the far right in Germany and elsewhere. So, but this is a great question. I think it operates the same as in cultural sociology. We have something called the omnivorousness literature that shows that, the upper middle class likes all cultural styles, music, except those that are associated with the groups that are really distant from them, like heavy metal and, so a former student of mine, Brittany Bryson, has a paper titled Anything But Heavy Metal, which is precisely about patterns of dislike and indifference, which corresponds to social distance. And in food, you have the same thing with the work of Sean Bauman at Toronto, which shows that, patterns of cosmopolitan eating is also very much a way of expressing class differences. So, but we are not there. We cannot address, we can only speculate on these questions, unfortunately.
Okay, Michèle, I'd like to get more questions in, and can we take them as a pair?
Sure, absolutely, and I'll keep my answers very short, so this way we can cover more.
One by Jutta Kohl and one by Heike List.
Michèle, thank you for this presentation. It's a very interesting book. I'm looking forward to reading it. I have two quick questions. The first one is, how do they distinguish themselves from their parents? I mean, what did their parents do right or wrong? What is the intergenerational relationship? And the second one is, at least I, as a Turkish person who grew up in Turkey, community is very important. But the American culture is always associated, at least where I grew up, where one pulls oneself up by one's bootstraps. So it's very individualistic. But in your paper, in your presentation, I read a lot on community, society for social change. So where is the individuality? Did you have findings on the individuality of American culture?
Yeah, thank you. It's nice to see you, Gotcha. Oh yeah, you want more than one.
Can we add Heike List's question, and then you have a chance for a brief answer?
No problem.
Thank you very much, Michèle. With none of these new narratives of hope, I could win back those social democrats that have voted for AfD in the last election. How do these narratives of hope that you've presented address both sides of the polarized society? Given that there's also the thesis that one reason for the polarization is also because the left has substituted the idea of equality with identity politics. Thank you. So this links up to Olaf's question. Thanks.
Okay, Michèle, your turn. Last word.
Okay. Good to see you, Gotcha. As you could see with the argument of braided cultural repertoire, that's where the individualism comes in. They are still embracing, a number of them are still embracing the American dream and neoliberalism, but they still very much believe in hard work. That's not going away. But they also want a balance with the therapeutic self, and they want greater equality. So we have done a quantitative analysis to assess what's the relative importance of these four repertoire. And right now, I don't remember their relative salience, but I know neoliberalism is far from being entirely gone. It's more like redefined. So they are far more distant from it and from their parents. If you think of most upper middle class or middle class parents as being anxious and wanting their kids to live the American dream, they will do it under their own conditions to the extent that it allows them to remain mentally sane and to also live their ideals. And they don't believe that, having a big house in the suburbs is a goal that is achievable or something that is very inspiring. The second question, I think, is very important. I think that how could we bridge the political divide with these narratives of hope? One thing I think that has not been explored sufficiently is the themes of kindness and just be a good person. My daughter was doing some canvassing in southern New Hampshire, not this election, the previous one, and she would come back home and say, these Republicans are really nice people. They're so kind. And I have, the idea that, you relate to people as human beings and you recognize their dignity. And although, and I think that this is something that Trump very much played on by his populism and his desire to be someone that the ordinary man can relate to, his anti-hierarchy, his dislike of, highly educated people. So I think that recognizing how a form of ordinary cosmopolitanism is one that recognizes that we're all human beings and we should be kind to each other. And this, I know, is something that really resonates for the working class. So the fact that for the progressive forces, identity politics in some ways has replaced this is something that we really need to think about. Because these are forms of humanism and also Christian thought or, Judeo-Christian thought, whatever. And it's also very present in Islam as well. The notion that we're all human beings, our universality, those are the things we share that brings all of us together. And this is something that Biden has been actually very good at. And he really played this humanistic card as well. So against Trump's vile nastiness. So, yes, thank you. Those are great questions.
Okay, we're practically out of time. But where's the question about the AFD? How does the dynamics of recognition? You analyzed, Heike List asked, how do they address anyone who would vote for a right-wing party?
How would our respondents do this? The Gen Zs?
Sorry, Heike, did I get your question wrong? I didn't hear you. Yeah.
Yeah, no, this was it. How do these narratives of hope give hope to those who have voted for the far right? And we learned from Moody that they presented a promise of, or at least illusion of inclusion. And the left talks about identity politics. That was the question, yes.
Mm-hmm. So you feel like the language of inclusion that the Gen Zs are using cannot reach them, those who vote for the right, because of the boundaries they draw toward immigrants and queer people? Is that the issue? Yeah, and my response is the humanism, the fact that ordinary universalism also takes this humanistic Judeo-Christian, we're all human beings. These are forms of rhetorics that appeal to everyone, to the left and to the right. So I'm saying the Democratic Party can win back the workers by being systematically pushing for other forms of inclusion that are not only about identity politics, that emphasize our shared humanity.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Michèle. There would be lots of more topics to talk about, but we have to finish here. Thank you so much for joining us. Thanks for the great talk.
It's my great pleasure. I'll try to join again this afternoon after I'm done teaching. So.
All right.
Okay.
And now I turn over to my colleague, Meyer, who will introduce Arlie Hochscheid.